and gave John Reid his speech. And it was just, John Reid admitting, that he was actually sort of quite Tebbett'ian in some of his views, and Tebbit having a sense of humour. It was brilliant.
Do you have when you think of Norman Tebbit, it was before your period in the lobby at Westminster, but what does that conjure for you?
So I know the spitting image
right
puppet.
sort of ghoulish
well,
sort of
they all were. I was in the House of Commons earlier today watching the Post Office statement, and immediately afterwards, Sir Edward Lee, who is the father of the House, sort of got up and made a point of order specifically to pay tribute to Norman Tebbit, and I wrote it down where he said he called him the original Brexiteer and the original campaigner against woke, and he got a really quite a nice compassionate laugh from all across the House. It wasn't particularly full because I think a lot of MPs were queuing up to see Emmanuel Macron elsewhere on the parliamentary estate, but I liked that. And Edward Lee sort of talked about how important Tebbit had been as kind of a mentor for that generation of young Thatcherite MPs, of whom Lee, now father of the House, is probably the last remaining, one of the few remaining ones. But how at the time it was fresh, it was energetic. This was a new cohort who had been inspired by Thatcher and by that programme. And he says that he encouraged him to stand to be party leader and Prime Minister when Margaret Thatcher resigned. And obviously he wasn't in a position to do so because of all the reasons that Tim outlined them. But clearly a figure who MPs today have a lot of respect and some degree of affection for.
Yeah, it's also, I think that laugh that you witnessed there, it's also partly a product of the way that passing time mellows a memory. And when Michael Foot called Norman Tebbit a semi-house trained polecat, I don't think there was a lot of affection involved in that.
He quoted that in the comments.
Yeah, but as Ian Duncan Smith, who I talked to about Tebbit earlier on today, he reminded us that after that, when Norman Tebbit was made a peer, he put a polecat on his coat of arms. I think a polecat with wings. So he kind of, on certain levels, he enjoyed
Reclaim
it.
the polecat.
Reclaiming the polecat. Sounds like a great slogan. You can put that at the next Tory party conference, but you won't be there. Maybe you can.
Well, that's a decision. I don't know whether I should go to the Tory conference or not this year. I'd love to go.
Will they let you in?
I don't know. I don't want to be unwelcome, you see. So I don't want to look like I'm, watching them too closely.
Yeah, well, okay. Let's see if they're big enough to let you in. We've got to move on. We've got more to talk about. This is Pienaar Friends on Times Radio with Barclays Business Banking. Grow your business. Bank on Barclays.
Business. Bank on Barclays.
Now, as the voice of the Times, here at Times Radio, we broadcast high-quality, balanced journalism live, free throughout the day, every day. That is what we do. But we only are able to do it thanks to the generous support of subscribers to the Times and the Sunday Times. And their contribution means that investment in the journalism and the journalists around the world is there for you to read and watch and listen to. So do join. Subscribe today if you haven't already. Head to the Times, times.com. Now, guys, I was going to get your thoughts on the Macron speech earlier on at Westminster, but I've just seen this. It's a line about a new YouGov opinion poll, which tells me, and you're going to say no great surprise about this, we can talk about this, but 75% of people in this opinion poll tell us that they're in favour of a wealth tax, a 2% tax on wealth above £10 million, which is roughly the sort of frame of the argument that's now being advanced by people who want to see a wealth tax. And apart from the fact that you think, look, it is a fact that people are quite often in favour of taxes they don't have to pay themselves.
Quite.
What do you make about this argument and where it's been going?
I I think we're going through a period. So we've just been talking about Norman Tebbit. One of the things the Thatcher years re-established in the British conscience, although the opinion poll evidence still showed a lot of antipathy towards private enterprise, even at the end of the Thatcher years, was that actually you did need to reward the entrepreneur. You did need to be aware that if you imposed the kind of marginal tax rates that Britain had at the end of the 1970s, there was a 98% marginal tax rate at one stage on earnings in Britain. You basically had what we called in the 1970s a brain drain. Talent left this country. And we learned that lesson the hard way after the 1970s. And Mrs. Thatcher was able to show that actually if you rewarded enterprise, you could have a booming economy. Britain stopped being the sick man of Europe and became one of the strongest economies in Europe during that period. I think we've forgotten all of that. Mm-hmm. We think we can have it easy and that you tax the wealthy, there's no cost to it. Well, we're conducting a live experiment at the moment, and I know the numbers are disputed, but I think they're pretty clear. The wealthy are leaving Britain again. We're not getting the inward investment we need. The talented people that take an awful lot of risk often to invest in a new business, to invest in a new technology or a new production process, they don't see Britain as the attractive place they once did. There are other reasons why Britain is becoming a place where you don't want to invest, property prices being high amongst them. But a 2% tax on the wealthy will, I'm afraid, stop the wealthy remaining in Britain or stop the wealthy coming to Britain. So it's a nice idea that we can tax the wealthy to sort out our problems, but already a very large proportion of tax is paid for by the high earners. Yeah. Most British people now are net receivers from the state. There's a minority of people who pay more tax than they get back in terms of revenue and benefits. Yeah. And you load that too far the wrong way and the British decline will accelerate again.
So, Rachel, how do you read the mood in Downing Street on this? It was only, it seems like, and I think it was, a very few days ago, that there seemed to be a line coming from Downing Street that they're not going to go there. They've heard the advice from economists who make the point that Tim's making there, and they're not going to take that risk of driving more wealth creators and entrepreneurs out of the country. And then just the other day, it started to be reported that they weren't ruling it in and weren't ruling it out. Is something moving there, or...?
Well, we also had Neil Kinnock's intervention over the weekend calling for it, and he had a very interesting line in that, which was it won't pay all the bills, but it will, I'm paraphrasing here, but it will send the right kind of message about who the government is for. So that there are kind of two strands to this. One is, will it raise the money that they need to plug their fiscal black hole and invest in public services? And two is, will it help them with their struggles over the narrative that they are attacking the people who are least able to pay, whether it's pensioners, whether it's people with disabilities, and answer this question about who a Labour government is for. And on the second point, you can see why a wealth tax is compelling, and you can see it in those poll figures with how the majority of 75% of people think it's a good idea because they know it won't affect people like them. And this idea that the state is broken and the rich should pay more, that electorally, that's popular. I'm not with Tim on the exodus of the wealthy, not least because we don't have those figures yet. And I also think you do need to distinguish between the kind of uber wealthy who have lots of assets, don't pay much tax at the moment because the highest taxes are on income taxes, and they're not necessarily earning their income in the UK, and they tend to be hypermobile anyway and always switching countries. So I'm not sure you can read too much into that. The ones that I'd be worried about are the high earners, not least because they're not earning that much in the UK in terms of what they could be earning possibly in San Francisco, possibly in Dubai. And those are the people who you really do have to worry about, because if they're leaving and their earning potential is leaving, that you're not getting the income tax in from that, which kind of leads me into why I'm with Tim on wealth taxes in general being appealing on paper, but why economists kind of hate them. It's very costly and difficult to measure that wealth. You have to set up another government body to do it. The evidence from across Europe shows they don't bring in anywhere near as much as they're projected to bring in. Our tax code is already, I wrote this down in the break, our tax code is 14 times the length of the King James Bible. It is incredibly complicated.
Not quite
and complex.
So beautifully written either.
speak for yourself. I think they're beautiful parts of our tax code. But, one of the things that economists on the left and the right say is that actually you could get quite a long way by simplifying the tax code, enabling businesses to engage in more economically productive behaviour because they weren't having to employ so many people helping them comply with the tax code. And then you could raise, say, income taxes a very small amount, much broader base, and raise much more money, which is coincidentally exactly what last week's New Statesman cover story argued that the government should be looking at doing. However, that would involve breaking one of the three pledges that Labour made going into the election, and the wealth tax was not one of those pledges. And you can see why they're looking to sort of raise tax via the back door. Although if you're looking at things that would actually help fix the public finances, they need to look broader and take the hit with upsetting people.
Maybe it's also worth just mentioning this fact that George Osborne, he did away with the top rate of 50p top rate of tax for the highest earners, but it took him 3 budgets to do that. It was certainly found not to be raising anything like the amount of money it was supposed to be raising, or they raised something, nothing like the amount that was predicted. But it stayed there. I think this was accepted. It stayed there for as long as it did stay there because the message issue, because the government at that time, the Cameron Osborne team in Downing Street, they wanted to show that they were treating the best off as well as the less well.
Wasn't it more partly though the Lib Dems were in coalition? They were objecting to the.
Sure, but it was George Osborne who made that point in the course of his various discussions of the subject. Well, now we're looking at a position where Labour's in a kind of a converse image of the same dilemma. And even though the economists' argument may be weighing in the mind of the Treasury and Number 10 Downing Street, it's possible, isn't it, that they're now looking at the message point too. And if she's forced, and she is going to be forced to put up taxes in the November budget, maybe she's going to want to accompany that with something which shows, but also hitting the cream of the crop.
I agree with almost everything Rachel said. A consensus breaking out in the studio. When you and I agree, Rachel, I don't know what that means.
Yeah, we can argue about the exodus of billionaires later.
Yeah, but it's largely agree. But the other thing, another stat that you could have added to your list of stats was that the number of countries that have introduced wealth taxes has actually fallen steeply because you introduce them in a moment of political opportunism, and then you find out they hurt eventually. And so, one thing that Britain has to decide: are we a serious country or are we an unserious country? Do we actually want to fund the NHS and other public services? Do we want to create jobs, or do we want to send messages? Do we want to posture? And we've got to decide which of those two things it is. And my hope is that Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer will prevail over a reassertive sort of backbench Labour population.
Before we go to the knees, what's your guess? You think we're going to get some sort of wealth tax?
We're going to get some tax increases in the budget,
for sure,
absolutely.
But a wealth tax.
I think they'll try and frame whatever they do as a wealth tax, whether it will be a wealth tax. I think that they might hit capital gains tax in a different way, whether it will be an entirely new tax with all of the administrative burdens that implies. I don't know.
Well, whatever it is, it's going to be framed as not being something that hits working people, even though it probably will. Wealth tax, do you reckon?
I agree with Rachel.
You agree with Rachel? It's all getting
very boring, isn't it?
Comfy and cosy in the studio.
We'll choose a topic where we can have a violent disagreement.
I'm going to change the subject and find something we can all disagree. This is Pienaar Friends. Now at 6:31, the news with James Kitchen.
Across the Business Banking. Find out how Barclays can help to move your business forward. Search Barclays Business.
And here with me on Pienaar Friends, Tim Montgomerie and Rachel Cunliffe from the Statesman. And here is Kate, also, who takes over at 7 o'clock. Hello, Kate.
Hi, John. Plenty of different areas to cover this evening. President Macron, of course, in his state visit. There's a big dinner going on this evening. We'll try and get a line into that and work out what's been happening and what is said at that big state dinner. Macron, of course, has been addressing the House, as you've been covering, talking about, well, promising to deliver on measures to cut the number of migrants crossing the English Channel. We know that he is all in on that, according to what he says, but it is what he does, of course, and we wait. We may not even get that whilst he's here, whether we can have this one-in, one-out deal on migrants to and from the UK.
He shouldn't have been given a state visit until he delivered, in my view.
Well, yes, we should have held it over him like that.
Exactly.
Perhaps they're going to offer us a lovely surprise on Thursday.
Or just hold back the pudding at the State Bank.
Yes, that's a wonderful idea. Let's just starve Macron until...
Hold him
there's
prisoner.
nothing like an angry, smallish Frenchman, is it? Starved of wine and cheese. He's also said that European countries must end their excessive dependencies on both the US and China. The US being the slightly trickier area for Keir Starmer to try and navigate to end our excessive dependency on the United States. I wonder how that went down. I think probably just Starmer will want to brush over that one carefully or quickly. We also speak to Lord Arbuthnot tonight. We've, of course, had the first stage of the Post Office inquiry today, which focuses on the compensation scheme for victims and just lays out the full truth of how people were affected. And we've heard about the a horrendous number of people who took their own life and others who contemplated it today. Lord Arbuthnot's been banging the drum over the Post Office scandal for a long time. He's on the Compensation Advisory Board. So talk to us a little bit about that. And this afternoon we understand from Politico that Fujitsu, the company behind Horizon, who the second part of the report will detail were complicit, did know that the system was faulty, have been able to keep bidding for government contracts despite saying that they wouldn't when Mr Bates versus the Post Office scandal came out on ITV. They're not really meant to be bidding for them, but they are at the moment going for a contract to keep running the border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So we talked to James Arbuthnot, who calls it an absolute scandal that they're still able to operate in that way. We'll talk about the Southport inquiry as well. Opening proceedings happened today. There's going to be a focus. We'll speak to Constance Kampfner, who's based up in the north for the Times, and she was there on the night of the Southport riots and spoke to us during that particular evening. What they're looking at today, John, is can you impose powers, curfews, electronic tags, internet bans on individuals who potentially pose a risk of serious harm, individuals that haven't committed any criminality yet, but authorities are watching and knowing may be an issue. How far can you go in terms of clamping down on their civil liberties? And that's what was laid out a little today at the opening proceedings of the Southport inquiry. So loads of different stuff to cover on the show. Edwina Curry joins us to remember Lord Tebbit as well.
Lots there for all of us at 7 o'clock with you, Kate. Now, Andrew Jones has written in. Thank you, Andrew, for writing into to the show, who sounds like a slightly cross working man. He writes in about the wealth tax. He says, I've worked for 40 years. Each month, all tax I owe is taken at source. Never had a tax rebate. Never been able to pay tax offshore. Never been able to pay myself in dividends to save tax. It's hard-working people like me, says Andrew, who are the backbone of the economy, not the few billionaires. Then maybe slightly undermines the argument by saying tax them to death and hopefully they will all leave, which arguably would not be the most desirable outcome when it comes to even billionaires who you may not have a huge amount of time for. We'll talk about doctors now. They have voted, the resident doctors, we used to call them junior doctors, they voted to strike in the period between now, not the entire period, but over the period between now and New Year, a 6-month period, which is a problem for all of us. It's a problem for the National Health Service. I spoke earlier to Dr. Melissa Ryan, who's co-chair of the Resident Doctors Committee at the BMA, suggested the government couldn't afford the pay demands that the junior doctors were making.
Doctors aren't to blame for years of austerity and underfunding, and so they shouldn't have to be the ones that are paying for it. So this government has promised to restore the NHS, but that can't happen unless they start investing in its staff. So it isn't really about financial constraints, it's about political choices. And I think that patients would prefer to have doctors working and staying in the NHS rather than leaving because of pay.
Tim Montgomerie, you were shaking your head vigorously through every line of that, so I'm going to ask you first, what do you think?
Am I allowed a 20-minute rant? Look, one of the things that's deceitful about these doctors' thing is they talk about the fact that their pay lost its value over a very particular period of time, and that all they're asking for is to be restored. They're very careful where they chose the starting point of this salary. If you look at it over the period when they had a very large increase at the end of the Labour years, actually they're already caught up. The fact is that the BMA, ever since the conception of the NHS, is a trade union. They fought the whole creation of the NHS. They've always been reactionary elements, I'm afraid, within the health service. And Labour encouraged this, though. One of their first decisions when they came to power was to grant a lot of the increase that doctors and train drivers and everyone else wanted. And the unions are coming back for more. This was predictable and predicted. And I feel sorry for Wes Streeting. Wes Streeting is a good guy. He's trying to reform the NHS. Labour are pouring billions of pounds into the NHS and to deal with the waiting list crisis. And the doctors, they should. Maybe there's other ways that they could be helped in their terms and conditions. But there isn't any money. There really isn't any money in this economy to give them the kind of wages that they want. And yes, of course, they can go abroad, but if you actually look at international comparisons of the kind of money that doctors earn, particularly when you include pension entitlements in the calculations, actually our doctors don't do very badly compared to Australia or Europe or Canada. And North America is slightly different because the USA, their health system is full of money in a way. It's a whole other subject. But they aren't that badly treated. This is, I'm afraid, trade unionism at its worst.
Right. I mean, Rachel, before you give your thought on this, I was struck a very short while ago by an opinion poll, a YouGov opinion poll, a new one, which tells me that 39% of people support these doctors taking action, the resident doctors, which is quite a big decrease since last summer when it was 52%. 48% are now actively opposed. This dispute, these strikes are going to become a test of public opinion, a battle for public opinion, which seems to me, as of where we sit here, to be a battle which is about to kick off, but a battle which the junior doctors, maybe the senior doctors, soon if they follow and take action too, look like losing.
It's really interesting. If you look at public opinion polls on pay disputes for different types of public sector workers, healthcare workers are always right at the top for most popular. I think nurses traditionally higher than doctors, but doctors also up there with the public, because we interact with the NHS and everyone has a story about an NHS doctor or nurse who really helped them, saved their life, helped a family member, and it's the area of the state that people are most likely to come into contact with, and therefore have quite a personal experience of. I think that the difference between now and last year is that they got the pay rise last year, and when you look at some of those figures, and I know that the BMA will almost certainly have a dispute with Tim about how they're calculated, which I'm not going to get into because I'm not an expert on it. I'll let you
just agree with
fight
me,
that out.
Rachel. Just agree with me.
I'm going to admit that I don't know, which is not something that people do on live radio often enough. But from the public perception perspective, I don't know anyone who automatically got a 22% pay rise over the last year outside the healthcare sector, and people are starting to look at their own incomes and going, hang on, you got yours already. Now there are two issues that I think are worth sort of considering with this. One is that the Labour government came in, they did the pay settlements kind of hoping that there'd been so much sort of industrial action, relations with the previous Tory government had completely broken down. They'd come in, fresh start, say yes, fix it, move on. What they said was that the cost of the pay settlements was less than the cost of strike action. And I remember at the time thinking, that's a really dangerous thing to say, because the cost of strike action is always going to be higher, because if you strike for days and days and weeks on end, then it's always going to end up costing more than the pay settlement is. So are you, by saying that, by making that argument rather than the moral argument, are you backing yourself into a corner that will come back to bite you, mixing my metaphors there, which seems to be exactly what's happening. The other point that I think is worth considering is what Tim said a moment ago about, is there other things that we could do? When you look at the lifestyle of a resident doctor, it's pretty hellish. They don't get there, it depends what field they're working on, obviously, and where in the country, but they don't get their shifts far enough in advance to be able to properly plan. There are stories of people not being able to get their wedding day off, for example.
Yeah.
They're all really short-staffed, which means that people are doing back-to-back shifts, not necessarily getting the overpay that they're entitled to, and they're no longer feel that they're being treated particularly well by the hospitals and healthcare institutions that are employing them. And that, I think, is as much of a driver for qualified healthcare professionals looking abroad as pay is are we going to be treated better? Are we going to have a better standard of life?
Well,
and is there a way to reform that side of it that makes the experience of being a doctor a little bit more, I don't know, sustainable, that isn't all about pay?
Well, I'm going to carry on my rant. These doctors, etc., they should understand what's happening to people in the private sector. People in the private sector are losing their jobs to AI. There's massive disruption taking place. People are seeing their salaries cut. The insecurity. They don't have a pension. They haven't had the kind of pension that doctors have had for decades now. And I was talking about Norman Tebbit earlier. The unions that used to have a grip on British private sector don't have a grip on British private sector anymore. The public sector unions still do have a grip, though, and they are protecting the doctors in a way that no one else in real life economies can enjoy.
Well,
and they need to be aware of that.
On the pensions point, there are proposals that a pay settlement could look at smaller pension contributions and more upfront salaries, because you can see how if you're a doctor and you're 35, yes, you do want to be saving for a pension, but you also want to be saving for a house. And if you have no means of getting on the housing ladder whatsoever, then the money might be worth more to you now than it would be at some point in the future. The issue with that is that none of us are saving nearly as much as we're going to need for our retirement.
James writes in saying, why do doctors think their pay should be pegged and locked into the highest level of pay they've had? The public sector doesn't work like that. Things change and circumstances change. The country can't afford yet another huge pay rise to match a high watermark from 2008. And Pete from Ringmar, he says, I was a police officer until 2020. As public sector, we were also hammered by austerity and turned over by the Tories. What makes doctors so special? They get redress and no other public sector do. Sheer bloody venality, and they should be ashamed, says.
Wow, that's interesting.
Which is also, I guess, a kind of, maybe that's an illustration of the kind of sentiment which is behind the fall off in support for striking among junior doctors that I mentioned. And
that's particularly interesting, because it isn't just like private sector against public sector. There's clearly a view inside the public sector as well that doctors are being treated a little bit special. Like nurses, if anyone does deserve more money in the NHS, it's much more nurses than doctors. They have struggled more in that pay comparison.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to say, but I mean, the problems of the Treasury and the deeply maligned Chancellor in just paying for public services is now well known to all of us. The Office of Budget Responsibility report that was published earlier today was hair-raising. It gave us in black and white the numbers that showed that public spending as it is unaffordable. It told us that greater debt was simply not a gamble that could reasonably, well, the OBR didn't argue this, but it's a persuasive argument that deeper borrowing is going to spook the markets and cost the state more than otherwise. And as for tax, they're going to go up, but we're at pretty much the limits of taxation at the moment. And against that background, doctors make, however persuasive a case for a pay increase, even if it's phased in. I mean, I think they do accept pretty clearly. They don't expect to be brought back, as they argued, a parity between 2008 in one go, but even a phased one would open the door to other demands. You've got the consultants waiting, you've got the nurses waiting, you've got every sector waiting. West reading whatever he wants to do. He's got no choice but to dig his heels in on this.
I wonder what the mood is with Labour MPs reading that report. I mean, I can guess, but what that report, the ABR one, shows is that you've got to make not just tough decisions, we've heard that a lot, but big decisions. That the gaps we're talking about are large and they are getting worse, and the the strategy so far since the election has been tinker around the edges, leave yourself a very small amount of headroom and hope that you get lucky. And we've had multiple examples of occasions where I really think the Labour government has been unlucky. But basically, you can't run a country on that wafer thin level of breathing space. And I think that the welfare row last week was a lot about party management and MPs not feeling that they were listened to and feeling like they were being taken for granted by the leadership. Is this going to lead to a more collaborative party management system where Downing Street sort of brings in, we can't bring them all at the same time because there are 400 of them, but brings in sort of Labour MPs and goes, OK, you've read the report now, you understand the situation we're in. No one is denying that, it was all the Tories' fault because they're Labour and they would say that. But, work with us here. You can't just have everything. It's not a sweet shop. And would that change the dynamic and the atmosphere and the mentality? I think it would go some of the way. I think it would actually make some difference. But they've damaged relations quite dramatically since the election. And that's really a conversation that you should probably have had with Labour MPs last summer.
OK, we need to take a brief break now. And here's some good news if you happen to be a Spanish tennis fan, less so if you happen to be an England tennis fan. Cam Norrie's been knocked out of Wimbledon.
No.
Carlos Alcaraz, not unpredictably, has kicked him out of the tournament. And he got to the quarterfinals, but he lost in straight sets. So he did well to get as far as he did. So let's look on the bright side. Maybe next year. More to talk about here on Pienaar and Friends with Barclays Business Banking. Find out how Barclays can help move your business forward. Search Barclays Business.
Get the day's politics.
Now, let's just recap on some of the big events, certainly in Westminster and Westminster politics today, and more widely, because I want to reflect for a moment on Emmanuel Macron's address to both houses of Parliament. It was a big occasion in the diary. He touched on some very big themes. They're not in great detail, but it opened up, lots of conversations at the very, very least. And these are serious conversations where the French president spoke about the war in Ukraine. And he gave this undertaking on behalf of him and Britain.
And together we worked very hard during the past few years in order to stand with the Ukrainian people, just helping them to resist. We were right and we are right. And because every time Vladimir Putin's Russia advances in Ukraine, the threat moves closer to us all. We will never accept the theory that might is right.
And he said, Europe would never abandon Ukraine, never, he said. And there was a round of applause for that sentiment in the House. Now, around the same time, President Trump in Washington has been talking about, his Russian cat about Vladimir Putin. Apparently he's not very happy.
We wanted to put defensive weapons because Putin is not treating human beings right. He's killing too many people. So we're sending some defensive weapons to Ukraine, and I've approved that.
So who ordered the pause last week?
I don't know. Why don't you tell me?
So apparently President Trump didn't know about the pause in weapon supplies to Ukraine that was announced by the Pentagon just a few days ago. He's not happy with Vladimir Putin. That supply of weapons, I presume they're going to be sold. Are they going to be given? I suspect possibly sold. It's better than not sending them. But President Trump is not in the business of leaning hard on Vladimir Putin, despite continually saying that another 2 weeks and he'll make up his mind on whether to impose really tough sanctions. And still we wait. This is so frustrating, isn't it, for Kyiv? So frustrating for Zelensky. So frustrating for Kyiv's friends, including Britain, including France and others in Europe. And is it really going to change, or should we give up hope on that kind of pressure being exerted?
Well, yes, and yes to what you just said, John. And, it's been someone who backed Trump at the last election, it's been the most frustrating of things that he has done, his position on Ukraine. And so, hear what I've just said before what I add. I think at a glacial pace, Trump, though, is moving in the right direction. I think the scales are falling from his eyes, and he's beginning to realise that Putin is not, going to be amenable to his persuasion, his wishes. And we've seen in recent times, I think we had the biggest bombardment of Kyiv since early stages of the war recently. And there is now, interestingly, in Congress in particular, you've got people like Lindsey Graham, the Republican senator for South Carolina. They're beginning to assert their hawkishness again. And I think Trump is hearing that as well. Trump, look, he's an incredibly controversial person, and he does often make mistakes on foreign policy. But actually, he's clearly frustrated with Netanyahu as well at the moment. He thinks that the war in Gaza has gone too far. He's clearly frustrated with Putin. It's taken him far too long to get to both positions. But I think he's nearing the kind of position most British people, or most people in the world who care about these things, would want him to be. It's been too slow, but he's getting there. And the Kremlin should take note. Yeah.
I mean, moving at a glacial pace seems to overstate the speed of the movement. Does the theory of scales covering eyes begin to cover it? If the president isn't aware that Putin is playing him and playing the world in the most transparent way, you've got to ask what on earth is wrong with him.
Yeah. I wish I could be... this is not the first time I've said this. I wish I could be as optimistic about the state of the world under Trump as Tim is. And I don't say this as a sort of highly partisan perspective. If Trump could be the one to bring peace to Ukraine and Europe and restrict Russia's aggression, then I would be delighted, and I would give him credit for that. I agree that the mood from the White House has definitely changed since that absolutely atrocious Oval Office humiliation, and I think Trump has begun to realise, as you say, Tim, that Zelensky wasn't the problem here. Does he realise that he's been played? I don't think, with an ego of the type that Trump has, that's a realisation that he's ever going to get to. And I think the worry is not that he moves into the right position at a glacial pace. It's that when it becomes obvious that there isn't an easy win here, a quick win here that he expected there to be, that he loses interest. And we've seen that in all kinds of areas of domestic and foreign policy, that he makes a sort of big splashy announcement, there are consequences, it doesn't work out, he moves on to the next thing. And that if you are Europe, if you are looking at the state of the Russia-Ukraine war, if you are trying to scramble together your defence systems in...
Scramble?
Like together.
Come on. I tell you what's more glacial, and I take your point, John, is Europe moving to rearm. The fact is, of course we could be frustrated at what's happening with America and Ukraine, but it's the only game in town. Europe doesn't have Patriot missile defences to give to Ukraine.
You can't expect that kind of rearmament to occur in the space of a few months.
Of course I can't, but I'd like it to start. Britain is almost doing nothing. The commitment we made at the NATO summit, a week or two ago, to most of our commitment to invest in defence is backloaded. We haven't identified where the money's coming from still. France isn't, accelerating much. The only country in Europe that is beginning to move quite quickly is Germany, followed after Poland's lead a few years ago. Look, the only hope in town for the next 2-3 years is for America to get there. That is the only option, because even if Europe moved at top speed now, and they're not, they would not be able to supply some of the essential missiles that Ukraine needs for its defence, let alone offence against Russia.
And does that not make you very worried that the President of the United States didn't seem aware that there had been a pause on armaments to...
I am happy to criticise Trump.
I don't know about that, you tell me. I mean, that's terrifying, right?
It's terrifying, but it's as terrifying that Europe has been sleepwalking even after we've seen what Trump has done over the last year, it's still sleepwalking on defence.
Well, it is true. They're not the only game in town, but they're by far the game that matters most, certainly when it comes to NATO. And when you get Mark Rutte saying, as he did in an interview at the weekend with the New York Times, that he thinks America gets it, they're going to have to be there in NATO at the heart of all of this, you also got to think that's a lot of wishful thinking, because we don't yet know. I'm not saying he's necessarily wrong, but we don't yet know that commitment is there in anything like the strength that Mark Rutte was painting it in that interview. But it's part of his job to be optimistic about it.
That's fair, John. I just wish we were... The amount of fire that we send Trump's way, a lot of it's justified. I just wish we sent a bit more Europe's way as well.
All right, got to leave it there. Tim and Rachel, lovely to talk to you. Come back next week. The invitation is open. Always the door is wide open. Thank you for listening. Angus Mitchell produced, Ollie Mansfield too, and our technical operator was Isaac Marley. Cakes up next. This is Times Radio.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio, the voice of the Times.
Thanks, John. Have a great night. It's 7 o'clock. This is the Evening Edition with Kate Borsay. Coming up.
France and the United Kingdom have a shared responsibility to address irregular migration with humanity, solidarity and firmness.
Emmanuel Macron says he'll work with Keir Starmer to tackle illegal immigration. We'll be joined in the studio by a French politician to assess a possible deal. We'll also go live to Windsor, where Macron is dining. There's a state banquet with King Charles. A major report says the Horizon IT scandal had disastrous impact on Post Office sub-postmasters. Advisor to the Compensation Advisory Board, Lord Arbuthnot, gives us his reaction. We'll go live to the US for the latest news in our Trump dump and, as ever, take a sneak peek inside tomorrow's Times. All of that and lots more. But first, the news headlines with James Kitchen.
Thank you, Kate. Good evening. The French President Emmanuel Macron has said the United Kingdom and France must